Pretty amazing. We have a few hundred people gathering from around the world. People are still coming in. So nice to see all of you from all the different aspects of my life and our life. The Mobius communities here, Coro community, Virgin community, activist community, some youth leaders are here. It's quite extraordinary. So maybe we'll get started. And I just want to first of all welcome you to the Evolution series. The first thing I want to say is I just want to wish you health. I want to wish health to you, to your loved ones, to those in your community. The second prayer I have is that the lessons that we're all learning come in gently, or as gently as they can. And as we sort of walk through this week, one of the most important things that we can do is be grounded. We'll talk in a little bit about how do we go through adaptive change, but it's so important for us to be grounded inside of ourselves, inside of our bodies. And so I invited my friend Morley just to lead us in the beginning of that. Morley is a singer, songwriter, activist, friend, grounded, beautiful soul. Morley, can I ask you to help us ground for a few minutes? And then we'll jump into some content and some frames. So thank you.
Everyone, for your beautiful work and for gathering, knowing the power of the circle, of gathering in this circle. I'd like to invite you to come to a very comfortable position in your chair or wherever you are, if you're lying down or sitting up. If you're in your chair, please scoot a little forward so that you feel your feet flat on the earth. And maybe push your feet a little forward so that your knees are not over your feet, so that they're a little bit, you can gaze down and notice your toes. That way your legs will be very relaxed and your hips will relax. And let's bring the crown of the head, the top of the head, towards the sky. Imagine the crown of your head going up towards the sky. And feel the base of the spine rooting down into the center of the earth. The sparkling center of the earth where all the minerals are shimmering. We're going to use our imagination to create more space in the body. Imagine a space in between the vertebrae. Maybe place a cloud in between each vertebrae. And let's bring the left hand to the heart and the right hand on the belly that feels comfortable for you. You can also just rest your palms on your knees. And gently close your eyes, or you can keep them open enough just to let the light in so that you really relax the face and relax the jaw, relax the tongue, and allow the tongue to rest gently on the roof of the mouth. We're going to focus our inhalations and exhalations through the nose. We're going to do a 6-count breath in a moment, but right now, just feel the spaciousness you are creating in your body using the power of your imagination. Crown of head to the sky. Base of spine down to the center of the earth. Breathing very slowly in and out through the nose. Also doesn't hurt to have a slight smile on your face. This will lift the muscles in the face and bring the breath in a high position. As you inhale, feel the warmth of your hands resting on your body. And as you exhale, feel the hands soften as the body exhales. It's the natural way we breathe as we're sleeping. Inhale, belly rises, ribs expand, chest expands. And then exhale, belly softens, ribs soften, and chest softens. Feel the length in your spine, space between each vertebrae. We're taking this moment to remember ourselves as an extension of the natural world. So imagine we're connecting down through our feet to the root system of the earth, deep and wide root system. Breathing into this place, the mineral world is connecting you keeping you grounded, shimmering, and powerful. Again, the crown of head towards the sky, luminous, connecting with the air in the room, gentle, calm, generous air. We'll now begin our slow 6 counts breathing. Exhale completely through the nose and inhale 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Exhale 3, 4, 5, 6. Inhale through the nose. Exhale through the nose. And don't worry if the rhythm is too fast or slow. Inhale. You can go at your own rhythm. The important thing is we are breathing in together. The breath of life. Exhale. Soft, soft belly, soft heart. Inhale. Expand. Exhale, soften. Inhale, belly rises, chest expands. Exhale, belly softens, heart softens. Inhale through the nose, expand, expand. Exhale, soft belly, soft heart, shoulders are water. Breathe in, expand. Exhale, soften, soften, soften. And a few more breaths like this in your own time. Breathing in the miracle of life. The body is made of water. Breathing in and blessing the waters of the body. Breathing out, blessing the waters of this one planetary body. Feel your inherent gentleness. And connection to the natural world. Continue your breathing, and I'll close with a short quote from Toni Morrison in celebration and reverence to the air we are so intimately connected to in our places where we're staying now. She said, if you surrender to the air, you could ride it. If you surrender to the air, you could ride it. If you surrender to the air, you could ride it. If you surrender to the air, you could ride it. Gently wiggle your fingers and toes and slowly bring your hands together, palms touching. And take a nice deep breath. And exhale. Have a beautiful meeting. Peace, wellness, and love. Thank you.
Thank you, Morley. Thank you so much for your time and your voice. Thank you for grounding us. We all could use some grounding in this time. So thank you. And thank all of you for coming to the session. Our hope is to provide a set of tools and ideas that are helpful as we're all going through this adaptive change. The ideas that we're going to share are coming from 20 years of work in adaptive leadership and change, and the Good Wolf process of helping people fortify themselves for change. But frankly, they also come from my personal experience and my life, and want to share some of those stories. As many of you know, besides the work I do, I'm also a widower who have, with young children, who have experienced life and the normality and the truths that I knew kind of move away. And so what we want to share over this time is a set of tools and practices that will help us get through. What I want to spend in as sort of at response to people's request is a bunch of tools in the beginning. We'll share some of these frames, and then we'll put us into small groups in conversation about how and what we're experiencing, knowing that each of us are experiencing this adaptive time in different ways. And so I'll spend the early part of this walking through these ideas, and then we'll be in conversation with each other. Part of what we do and know as we do this is that there's different skill sets needed. So this week, every day, we're going to be spending time on different things. Today will be the introduction to adaptive leadership. Tomorrow, we're going to spend some time on kind of scenario planning and a very structured method for planning what's happening to you and those decision trees. We'll spend some time on productive disequilibrium and growth, how to sort of modernize our self-protection and be safer in this process. And then Friday really end with how do we make the tough choices that may be in front of some of us. Just a gentle reminder as we kind of start into this is that we're all going through this collective adaptive experience, that none of us have been fully prepared for what's happening. One of the ways we understand adaptation and trauma work is that our system is not yet ready to handle everything that's coming at us. And it's natural to be all sorts of things, from engaged to overwhelmed to tired to hiding to those things. And so we want to find the kind of path forward through this. And then the last gentle reminder is just that being an adult or adulting is not to suffer privately, but be able to metabolize what is happening to you and to those around you, and hopefully getting the help you need. By definition, being part of this community, you have some safety net. We'll spend some time at the end of this call pointing to some organizations that are helping those without a safety net, but we hope that we'll be able to get some support. And by metabolizing, we want to give you some tools and practices and community to do some of that. For those who are less or more familiar with adaptive change or adaptive challenges, that one of the things that helps us understand them is that there aren't existing solutions to them, that we sort of have to change our lives, our hearts, our minds, the way we exist, and that we have to give up kind of some of what was, and we have to emerge into something new. I think it's important to also say that adaptive work is also exhausting. Many of us no longer know the difference between weekdays and weekends and are quite exhausted. And there's kind of, in my mind and experience, there's three different kinds of exhaustion. There's the exhaustion when you need sleep. There's the exhaustion when you need peace. And there's the exhaustion when you need nourishment. And it might be useful just to check in with yourself if you are tired, of which of those you need, and which of those do you have some access to. The thing we want to kind of talk about as we get into this is the general idea that adaptive leadership lands in each of us quite differently. It lands in each of us with our own history with challenge and change and trauma. It lands in us with our own experience of how do we deal with ambiguity and stability. For some people, they're experiencing a rigor to living with a discipline of focus that the systems around us are broken. For other people, this has been their whole life. And the sort of daily focus of how do I work with what I have is quite different. Obviously, this is also quite dependent on our own stability and privilege. One of the things that's quite obvious in these moments is how much privilege and space we have. In some of the work we do, we talk about privilege being the freedom to look away. And so what's really interesting for all of us at the moment is what are we choosing to look at? Where are we defining the scope of our lives, of our work and kind of who we're working with. And lastly, what's sort of our internal and external challenges and sort of realities of where are we equipped to this? What decisions do we have in front of us and around us? We also know that living in adaptive times in this work has chapters. It goes in different phases of where we are. We see so many people trying to hold on to the last chapter of where their business is or where their lives are, and we're nowhere in chapters. I'm in New York at the moment at one of the epicenters of this illness and crisis, and it feels like it's just getting closer. But we can begin to anticipate this next chapter of what happens in our communities as each of our communities and businesses reach its peak. When each one of us knows someone who's infected, when it's getting closer and closer to us. We also know that there will be a phase, at some point further out where the dominant frame of what we're doing is not the crisis. And so part of the question is, how do we prepare ourselves for this phase, but also these future chapters, knowing that they will shift and turn. And part of the question on these calls is, how do we equip ourselves for what is now and what will be? Each of us is very much in our own kind of place of sense making. If we're lucky, we're doing sense making with other people. There's this kind of mountain we often climb in sense making, and ask you to think about, where are you? Where are your loved ones? Where are your companies? And trying to make sense of what to do in this space. There's obviously this input and this change that's happened around us. Some of us are just in this beginning process of awakening and discovering of what it means for our own lives. Some of us are in meaning making. Some of us are in this wonderful question and doubt about what will the future look like. But also many of us are trying to wonder and have doubt about what was this world, and where are the holes? What are we seeing now of the fragility of our lives or our system or our workplaces? Where are the gaps between care and support that we needed? What do we do with our children that some of us now have to spend an enormous amount of time with? What do we do with our parents that we love but are quite stubborn in ways we don't want to look at ourselves? Well, each of us are in this arc of sort of the sense making and decision making, and ask each of you to kind of figure out and place yourself where you might be, and what would it take to take the next step. Because where we are headed is certainly to drive choices and make choices of how we live our lives and who we do it with. Clearly, one of the things that COVID is allowing us to do is see, when we have shared intention, what's possible. But we'll come into more questions of how we do this in a moment. We're going to spend today really talking about kind of adaptive change in some ways and how it happens. Part of what we know in adaptive times is that we're moving from the world we have known to the world we're moving to. There are still some who want it to just go back. We believe it will be different. It may be quite different from what we've known. We certainly will experience people returning some to institutions and practices that they've had. All the secondary institutions will be questioned in terms of education and norms and food and everything that were happening. We're sitting in New York when it looks like 50 to 60% of restaurants may go out of business in the next 3 to 4 months. We think about the online and relationship to food and delivery and what happens there. But really beginning to question what part of what was will be here on the other side of this crisis chapter. And ask us not just what was in terms of our businesses, but ourselves. What version of me was comfortable or numb in that last system that will now have some freedom to operate and move forward? The real question many of us are asking now, in a very real way, is what is essential? When we think about adaptive change, we don't often just run to what is it that we're growing into. We want to start with this fundamental stabilizing question of what is essential now. What is it that we can respond to in this process? We ask you to keep yourself on mute till we get to some of the Q&A later, if you don't mind. But for many of us, we're discovering what is essential in relationships. Who are the people that we're spending time with and getting comfort in now that we're not in the same routine of work? What is essential in terms of our food and relationships? What is essential in terms of what our businesses and companies deliver in the world? What is essential in terms of where our faith comes from? What is essential in those different normalities of what life is? And part of what we're then also asking is what's emerging. What is emerging for how do we begin to live our lives? What's emerging for the practices of which we can connect to folks? Which is emerging in terms of what we will do with our time and our discretionary attention. And this fundamental question of emergence is not just some blue sky brainstorm of everything that could life be, but what will be normal for us 3 months from now, 12 months from now, 3 years from now? What are the emerging practices of what we have to be able to equip ourselves for? And then lastly, sort of what is it time to let go of? What part of the what was and our normal way of working should be part of the past? What do we have to let go of? One of the things that we realize and learn in adaptive change is that people are not afraid of change. People are not afraid of change if it's guaranteed to be good for them. What people are afraid of is loss. What people are afraid of is giving up how they've learned to be in the world, even if it's sometimes dysfunctional. Part of what we've seen in this last chapter of how we worked is we held on to so many dysfunctional ways of being and normalized them. And so we start to think about this question as we adapt our lives, the way we relate to family, the way we relate to ourselves, of everything that's in front of us. What is essential to the future? What are the things we're going to hold on to? What is emerging that will be part of who we are and how we live our lives? And what do we let go of? And in some very real ways, there's different skill sets here. The skill set of what's present and essential is a skill set of management, or the skill set of how do we efficiently deliver what is? How do we efficiently do that? In a very real way, the work we're trying to do is also about risk and experimentation. What are we trying to do to learn new ways of being? How many of these companies are going to be here that are going to be the new practices? How do we understand what we're going to grow into? This rush to make everything digital, how much of that will survive 3 months, 6 months from now? For those of us who are leading companies with really questions about how much of our staff, our team, what skill sets will we need are going to be really important. There are so many companies that we see and are working with where they're asking the technocrats of the old system to design what's new. It's really a wonderful question of where is the ingenuity going to come from? Where are the practices going to be of troublemaking, of discovery, of creative thought? When we go into crisis, our imagination often gets squeezed. And so where do we create spaces and grounding so we can risk and experiment on the right things? Where are those questions of what orthodoxies that we lived with will we now test and change? And that becomes really important. But the other thing that's really important for us to look at and examine is of the past, what do we do with that work? What parts of the way we live our life do we let go of? And what do we find in doing this work is that there's some pieces of our life and our work that we certainly are ready to kiss goodbye. The number of people wearing dress shoes and dressing up for these calls has gotten down, right? There's parts of the old constructs that we're happy to leave behind. But in a very real way, there's parts that are very painful to leave behind. And what we find in doing this work is when we are moving forward, for some things we use the word hospice, but how do we let go with grace aspects of our life that were real and true and dear and important? We know in companies and teams and communities that if we haven't done some of that hospice work, that the ghosts of those things still exist and haunt us. And so one of the invitations we have for all of the people leading companies and families and teams, even with my own children at dinner, of the norms of what we gave with, how do we say goodbye to those with some care and process? And so what starts to happen is some really interesting questions, realizing that in a very real way, we're all kind of sort of overwhelmed with challenge of how to make sense of these times. But when we can bring some discipline to what's in front of us, what is essential that I have to focus on? How do I bring my attention and efficiency to those things? How do I begin to try and emerge some of these new practices? And how do I let go of those things that have been tried and true but no longer remain is really important. My mantra last year was let go or be dragged. And this act of letting go is something we're being forced into doing that some of us have no practice in or need some more practice. And so as we kind of go into this moment, it's an invitation for us in a very real way, hopefully with some discipline and focus, to say of those things that I was doing, how can I chronicle those pieces? How can I chronicle them to understand which ones of those I should just pause, literally just put on the shelf and maybe revisit after this crisis chapter is over? Which are the pieces that we can raise a glass and toast ourselves that are no longer part of what we do? How do we say go and kiss goodbye to those? But then what is the process of letting go with some grace? How do we acknowledge the family and routines and all of those pieces that we have to do in our businesses? Some of the largest parts of our identity of who we are and how we engage with people, we can no longer access. And so how do we let go with some of those? Part of what we're trying to do in the present is also try and figure out, what are we going to continue? It makes our life a lot easier when there's things that we can relax into and land on. When there's pieces where there are things that we know we can do. For me, spending a lot of time trying to do sense making, there are moments where I just drop into these activities, and it's just a little bit of an awkward, nerdy vacation to drop into things we know how to do. And so how do we do those? And what are some of them that require some slight upgrades? And where do we kind of operate and engage with those? And then lastly, as we think about what's emerging, what are the emerging priorities? What is worthy of your focus and time and investment? What are sort of the keys to the problem solving that you need to do? And so as each of us look at the body of work and the hours we have in the day, we can really start to look across these three different areas of what is it that we have to let go of? Can we do this work early, of letting go and deliberately, so we're not sort of carrying that baggage around? How do we let some of our teams do that? How do we understand that for ourselves as well as we kind of step into this space? Part of it is also quite humbling, because we know that not just we have to do that work. Some of us are decision-making authorities. We have responsibility to make decisions over so many other people's lives. But also everyone we're dealing with is starting to understand and grapple with these things. We're trying to figure out, how do we lead teams and family members through their own process of adaptation? And we find when we bring some attention to this, it's really quite helpful. I was a double economics and fine arts major in school. And one of the biggest lessons from the art practice was actually having structure generated creativity. Part of having structure allowed us to go in to explore different things. And so while everything can be overwhelming in these periods, and it is, because part of what we're trying and forced to do in adaptation is look at everything to say, is this true? Is this stable? As companies, as adults, all we're trying to do is find stable attachments. And so now we have to re-examine those things. But we found that when we bring people through this process, we can get much more organized about how we're spending our time. And part of what we're trying to do is to figure out how we can evolve together, how we can do this work. So what we want to do in a few moments is just kind of shift and put us into some small groups to ask us to reflect on, as we're in this moment of adaptation, as we're sort of having a very human moment, and allow people to kind of share that way. What's happening inside of you? And what are the discoveries that you're making between what is essential? What are the things that you're letting go of that might be hard to let go of? What are things that you're just holding on to with the gripped edges of your fingers? But also, where is the emergence coming from? Where is the gratitude and understanding of what's possible? Part of what we're trying to live in this moment is this sort of dichotomy of the future that's possible and the past that we have to let go of. We're living in this dichotomy of some of the best of our human nature coming out and some of the worst. And some of us are seeing that all over the place. So we're going to invite you to sort of step into smaller groups. Many of you know each other, many of you don't. So just please take a moment to introduce yourself. We'll spend about 20 minutes or so in these smaller groups just talking about what is coming up for you as you try and think about what's in front of us. And then we'll come back and spend the last period of time with some reflection and Q&A. Now the big question is, can I do the breakout groups on my own? which I will try to do in a moment. But bear with me for 1 second. Okay, here we go. We'll put you in the breakout rooms for about 25 minutes, and then we'll come back for 20 minutes or so. We'll come back with some Q&A. I'll keep you posted on this. We just invite you to introduce yourself, share what's coming up for you, and if any of these concepts of essential, emerging, loss are meaningful, please share from there. Thank you so much. You'll see on your screen, you'll click on a button, and it'll allow you to click over to your rooms. There's a small button that says join your breakout room. If any of you are unassigned, I'll put you in one. You should be able to click over now into your small groups. Please introduce yourself. A small group will be popping up. The few of you who are not assigned to rooms, I'll do that now. Should be a thing to click on your screen to join your room. There's a few of you still in the large group room. Please click over if you can. Hi, Rachel.
Easy.
I'm just going to keep moving. There's a few unassigned people. I'm going to assign them to small rooms.
Great. Looks like 25 or probably 23, not including us.
Yeah. Okay. Please click over to your small rooms. If you need help, just let us know. There should be a little thing on your screen. Let us know if you need some help clicking over. Can see you, David and Anusha. Feel free. Do you need help? There should be a small box.
What about something like Breakout? Sorry, I'm doing this on my iPad and I'm a little, yeah.
Okay.
So how do I switch to the small group again?
There should be a small
I would actually hover over the bottom of your screen and then you should receive a bar and there's a button called Join Breakout Rooms. If you've already been assigned, if you click on that room, it'll send you directly there. So just hover over the bottom. I'm not sure if that works exactly the same on an iPad, but.
There's a few of you that haven't been assigned, so I've been moving you over.
I have no icon that says go to the breakout room, sorry.
No worries. I haven't actually experimented with this on an iPad, so.
Yeah.
Hey, Rich,
And
I'm trying to get into the breakout rooms, but I'm not able to do that. I'm sorry. I'm reaching out for help.
All right. I will try and move you now.
I appreciate it.
You should have just got another pop-up. Did you get one?
Nothing.
Okay.
Are you able to hover over the bottom of your screen where the mute, stop video, all those functions show up? There should be a button called the Join Breakout Room.
There's none.
Okay. Why don't we just keep us as another breakout room? And I may have to jump out to do that, but let's just have our conversation here.
Lovely.
And we'll try and figure out how to problem solve that a little bit.
And if anyone is still in the room here, go ahead and start your video and then we'll know you're active to join us.
Yeah. So would anyone like to start sharing of where they are and how they're evolving or what's happening in this moment?
Well, this is Jorge. I would like to start. I'm located in Bogota, in Colombia, in South America at this point. This is, for Colombia, the third week in a row of quarantine. So we've been in isolation that has been forced by the government with best results so far. So basically what we're trying to do is to work remotely, stay connected, having, you know, every kind of contact with clients to make, you know, the business to keep it alive. And on the other hand, you know, I'm mixing that at the same time with the home activities. My husband is not in Bogota with me; he's with his mother, and you know, I'm struggling with the fact of being able to do work stuff and my personal stuff, work out, rest, and that kind of stuff. So in the middle of that midst is where I'm standing at this point. But I was very looking forward to join these sessions because I truly believe in the same thing that you bring into these rooms. So I'm very excited to be here.
Great. I'm curious what other people are experiencing. What are you in the middle of? What is the thing that you're discovering or struggling with, or just all of us, I feel like, are in the middle of a discovery process.
One of the biggest discoveries that I'm finding, or you know, awareness processes that I am at this point, is how not to feel blame or guilt of doing things that I shouldn't be doing while I'm on workable work hours. You know what I mean? Because I still have to do things in my apartment and at home. So trying to deal with that guilt / blame part is one of the things that has been difficult for me, and I'm adjusting. That's how I feel at this point.
Let's hear from someone else. What else is going on?
Hi, I'm Anusha. I'm in India, and our government just did a shutdown in 4 hours about 2 weeks ago. So it was quite difficult to move, transition life from I think things will change, we don't know, to like complete shutdown. And I work for the past almost 2 decades. I've been working with girls and women, and my organization works with adolescent girls. So we work with a very difficult to reach population when there is no connectivity, and most of the girls we work with don't own a cell phone, don't. So for the first time in two decades, I've realized that there's just, I mean, so much power in being with a community, but we just need to figure out how to. And we had a complete breakthrough today where we were able to get in the parents' numbers and able to talk to a few girls, just get a sense of what's happening and how they're dealing and coping with it. Just come back with so much of positivity to say, no matter where you are in the world, when you're put into such a situation, adapt. So this session, rounding up my day, is just a beautiful way to end the last 2 weeks, in fact, of a lot of chaos.
Thank you for sharing.
This is Samantha. I'm in New York, so you know, we're hit pretty hard, and just had to make some major changes within the organization I worked with to cope with the economic realities, and just had an announcement to make to our team this morning about furloughs. So this series is coming at a good time. I think we're all needing to learn how to adapt and continue to maintain some level of productivity and motivation and inspiration in the midst of this crisis. So thank you.
Others?
Hi, everyone. This is David.
I can go.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
You go.
No, go ahead,
you
David.
go. Hello, everyone.
Okay. So it's... okay,
You go.
I'll go. Okay. Yeah. So this is Serhan from Istanbul, Turkey. I am also going through different feelings and different experiences. I wouldn't call it negative or positive. I mean, I am frustrated to our government, the way they handle things. I'm sure most of you understand what I'm talking about, about what is happening in Turkey. We had to shut down ourselves in. a couple of weeks ago. We still didn't, but I would call it the white collar workers. We're working from home, people like us. And then yet a lot of people still have to go to work because they make their living by day-to-day work, and they need that. So also protection for the medical staff is very limited. So we raise funds to support them and all of that. And this country has money, and still the way government handles it, I'm really frustrated. On the other hand, doing my work, supporting people, bringing my creativity to my work has increased a lot. I'm discovering how creative we could become. We immediately switched to online products, to trainings, webinars, coachings, and sessions, assessment centers. Even we're doing assessment centers online. So we managed to do that. I'm loving how people are adaptive in a practical way and creative way. So I'm also enjoying seeing that part that comes out. I'm loving the collaboration that we have. I, of course, have my anxiety and fear economically because I have my own consultancy company, and I have a staff of 15 people that I want to keep paying their salary as long as I can. So it's also creating anxiety in me. As far as my health and my family's health goes, I'm feeling okay. I don't have any anxiety or frustration. So it's a mix of all of those. So, but I'm feeling grounded and optimistic and curious to see what will show up in this process. So, David, you're free to go.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm dialing from London. This is week 5 in isolation for me. So I had to come in early, having been in Italy. I manage a team of about 150 people spread around a dozen countries at the moment. And I've been struck by how quickly people have adapted, how kind people have been to each other, how supportive, and how committed people are to sort of overcome this issue. I think there's a lot of optimism, despite what we're reading and seeing in the press. Part of the trick for me has been not listening to too much news. Part of it's, for me, been trying to retain a sense of what was normal. So I now do my training sessions with my trainer on Skype rather than going to his gym. Maybe that's part of how I'm trying to exercise some control over where we find ourselves. But I've sort of gotten to my new regime, and optimistic by nature, and I think we'll see this through.
That's great. Any others want to share sort of where they are? And part of the challenge, I think, is what I hear in all of us is how do we live between optimism, as you described it, David, and realism? How do we live between the space that things can be better and will be better, and how do we deal with the realism that there are really tough decisions in front of us? And I think that weighs on us of how to do that well. How does the expression of our values get tested when we have to make choices between short and long term, or between our stability and other people's stability? And yes, I think there's incredible ways where we're seeing how quickly we can adjust. 5 weeks in isolation feels like a long time, and not something I want you to fully adjust to. Right. And so how do we understand what do we need to do in the moment versus what we need to do in the longer frame becomes quite critical. It's this space of realism. And I'm wondering in London, especially because what it feels like in New York, which feels like other places, that the illness is getting closer and closer in. That those who are affected by it and the cost of it is not yet known because it's gone from abstract to neighborhoods to family members. And how have you experienced that in the sort of radius or the distance of it in London, David, if you don't mind sharing?
No, not at all. I think the context of where we find ourselves is, if you look back at what we've spent the last 3 or 4 years dealing with, if you live in this country, particularly if you live in London, which is, without getting into the politics, the division which was present here because of Brexit.
Yeah.
That word no longer exists in the language, for the short term at least. So in a way, this has been an opportunity for the country to pull together and for the city to pull together. So if that's some benefit which might come out of this, as to what people are feeling generally in the city, in London, it's hard to tell, because the guy you talk to in the coffee shop, you're not having the chat in the coffee shop anymore, or the picking up the dry cleaning, or having a shave. So the day-to-day interactions by which you communicate with people are just gone. And if I think about it, but mind you, having said that, I never thought I'd have a Skype dinner party, but that's what we did Friday night. So in a way, I'm communicating more with people, both professionally and socially, in a more meaningful way than what I did in the past, because there was a lot of white noise and fluff in the past.
Yeah, that comes down to this essential idea that we talked about a little bit. Other reflections in the last few minutes of our small group?
You mentioned about values, Zander, as you were speaking, and I'm noticing we're finding different ways of fulfilling our values. And what I'm seeing in the people around me is that some values that have not been, I would call it, honored before, are now being honored, actually, to contribute maybe, or like in my case, creativity, I would call it. So I'm also noticing how when, like, freedom value is probably being underlived at the moment, but some values are also that we don't maybe experience day to day are now being fulfilled in our day-to-day lives in the current situation. That's what I'm noticing as well.
Yeah. It's also really interesting to me where people are drawing the boundaries of where their values are, of who they're putting in the circle of support and connection. And especially people with power can make very different decisions of where they draw those lines. So values to me is interesting. The boundary of those values is also interesting to watch. And of course, there's a crisis moment, and then there's the moments beyond that.
If I can share, actually, it's been a great time for us to also understand how to deal with silence, because I believe that in the way we lead our lives, even if we try to ground ourselves, we are constantly parallel processing so many things. I think to deal with isolation and silence, and the way that communities and individually we are doing that, is really admirable. And I wish we can continue. I hope that this is not just the phase where we're in a crisis and we're doing it, but to go back to those small things that ground us on an everyday basis. It's been a great learning experience for the past 2 weeks.
Beautiful. We're just having people come back from their small groups, and so we'll just wait a moment, a few more seconds for people to come back. We're going to share some thoughts, but if you have questions you want to, please put them in the chat, or we'll raise our hands in a little bit, or just different experiences. In the small groups, you can imagine there was quite a variety of what was shared, from very intellectual conversations to much more human, emotional ones, both with groups sitting on one side of decision-making of their jobs and careers and job loss and retention for others who are waiting for those answers from the other side. So if there's questions that you have, let's explore that. We're just going to give one more moment for people to come back. But let's hear from 3 of you from your small groups who want to just share what you talked about or anything that came up. Let's hear from 3 people before some questions. Anyone like to share what's happening for them?
This is Natasha. I'll share from our group.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Natasha.
One of the common themes amongst the 4 of us was this feeling of gratitude that we had already focused in on the essentials to us, and feeling deeply grateful for the moments we were enjoying with our family and our homes, and a feeling of disconnect between the beauty of the bubble that we were in and the trauma that was going on outside, that we felt unable to help as much as we would like. And I think that was saying sort of almost guilty to be so comfortable in such a difficult situation and how we could do more. Thanks.
Yeah.
This is Vicky or Victoria. The four of us was very different. Someone working in a children's hospital and actually being very active in dealing with this, and at the same time being grateful for everything, and someone being in a stage of anxiety and his whole business just falling apart, and at the same time kind of disconnected, waking up and saying, is this happening? But grateful at the same time. And then another person that is really trying to figure out about managing her life at this moment. And then myself in a very serene, very observing and watching, and at the same time caring and seeing where we can be doing pro bono coaching or some hotline to help others, etc. So very, very useful, but very differentiated experiences.
Maybe we'll hear from one more person and we'll drive into some other questions.
Hi, Zander. It's Sven here from
Hi,
London.
Sven.
Good to see you. I just want to bring in one snippet from what was a great discussion and great to meet new people. It was the notion around time and the notion that this is time is dense at the moment, time density. So openness of so much access to learning and resources on the one side, and almost like and how do I cut through that and have enough time to absorb all of that? And certainly I thought it was a wonderful prompt, because my instant reaction was, you can't think yourself through this, you have to feel your way through this. And for me personally also, it's like on a Tuesday, the Monday feels like a week away, and that's a new life feeling. That's crazy.
Yeah. Thank you for those comments. Please ask questions into the chat as well. Just to sort of comment on the time question, is that part of the challenge of time, or the part of the challenge of all of this, is where do we bring discipline? In a way, everybody who's on this call has some form of responsibility, and other people who look to you for help. As the crisis goes higher, they're just going to ask more of us. And all of us who are here, who have responsibility and authority and decision-making, could just expect an upsurge of requests. In some ways, I think it's a fair idea that their job is to take as much of us as we can give them. And so this question of where do we draw boundaries, where do we do that pacing, is going to be very critical. And yes, I think this is happening to us in our mind, in our hearts, in our emotions, in our bodies. I, as a child, was very enamored with the idea that we only use 10% of our brain. And my neuroscience sister would tell you, you can't do more than that, but make good Scarlett Johansson movies and other things. But it's really true to me that the intelligence that we're going to need to get out of this is not just in our brain, but in our emotional capacity and our spiritual capacity. And it's the intersection of that modalities that helps us get through adaptation. Part of why we got here is too much time in our brains. And you can feel inside of us, for many of us, this feeling of being out of control, this feeling of trying to stay half a second ahead of what's happening as a need to control it and make sense, is very addictive. And yet part of what we need to do is actually be present to it. I was listening to an On Being podcast, and Krista was saying beautifully about the challenge right now is to befriend reality. And my reaction is like, reality is being a jerk. And so how do I befriend reality? And part of what we talked about in one of the small groups is, how do we live in this space between realism and optimism? Realism of what this is requiring of us. Realism for some of us who don't expect for 12 months to get back to some kind of normalcy, or even normalcy might even be the wrong word, or a period where this isn't dominant in what we're doing. And so how do we equip ourselves in all the facets of who we are? How do we equip ourselves with discipline and time management? One of the things we think about in adaptation, when people come at us and they say, I'm so overwhelmed, part of us has empathy and compassion for them. And then another part of us says, you need help with your priorities. And this is a very difficult time of prioritization. But those are some thoughts that came up from that. I think the other thing that came up, just to say and comment on, is the question that we all have of where are we drawing the boundaries of our work? Where are we drawing the boundaries of who we're looking after? And that act is an act of leadership itself, but a difficult act. And there's many of us who are saying, I'm defining it by my family or by my small boundaries. And this idea that came up before, we may in this be seeing false sense of boundaries, a false sense of where we live it. One of my concerns is that in society, we're learning that if you optimize the pieces, the whole thing doesn't optimize. And so how are we carefully, with a deeper breath, with whatever space we have after what it takes just to survive through this, thinking about who are the boundaries of what we're trying to hold on to. What we're trying to do in this evolution series, just to pause for a moment, is every day introduce a different concept. We want to invite any of you who want to stay on for the next half hour just to do more Q&A to get into some of this. But before we do that, I just wanted to quickly share for those of you that each day while we do a different theme, tomorrow we're going to go into a deep dive into scenario planning and a very structured method of how do you look at different scenarios that are in front of you. And so we'll really take the time, because it's really important to say, what are the different things that could happen? How prepared am I? And bring that through a decision-making filter for your business and for yourself. Again, we'll stay on for another half hour, but I just wanted to highlight this for a moment. The other thing I want to just highlight before some people leave is that I think we're about to go through a decade of some of the most difficult mental health challenges facing us as a society. We're also facing some of those right now. And so the crisis text hotline is one of the best resources I know. You simply text HOME to 741-741. I don't think that's available in every country that's on this call, but just so people know that in the immediacy, that would be important. And then lastly, what Cut 50 and Van Jones is doing, and some of my friends and work colleagues in the criminal justice space, is really important for how do we support people who have less of a safety net. And so each day we're going to highlight a different organization that does that, but Cut 50 is one of those. So I want to invite anyone who wants to stay in this conversation. I'll come through some of the questions now, but also invite you to come back tomorrow, where we'll do a much more in-depth on scenario planning methodology. So let me try and come to some of these questions now, or if someone has one they want to ask while I'm looking through them, that would be helpful too. Does anyone have a question they want to ask in the meantime, or I should just dive into one of these?
Can we speak, or does it need to be a question?
Why don't you speak while I'm looking for one? That would be great, because I'm trying to do technology and this simultaneously. Who has a question? Yeah, go ahead.
It's Frank speaking. My observation was from the breakout group that we may miss the opportunity of what is possible going forward, because we are too much into what's essential at the moment.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? What you think?
It's my own observation, and also the discussion we had that I think some realized that we have to think through what comes at the end of this. Now, can we make this a better place? But at the moment, maybe at least looking at myself, I'm dealing too much with what is essential at the moment. So I'd like the question is how to make sure that I shift to what is possible versus the essential.
Yeah. So I think in a very real way, though, that essential question is the first question. Part of what we have to do in adaptive work is to stabilize what is. So it makes sense to me in the early phase of the crisis that would be the first act. And that act of saying what is essential is not an easy question. And so I admire and applaud people who are asking that in some very honest ways about what is essential. And I do think that's the first act. Part of what happens is that act can't continue indefinitely. It is the first act of a crisis, but is not the solution over a crisis. Because if we don't start to build some of the emerging practices, we don't try some new things, we don't give some space to make the risks of those things 80-20 rather than 50-50, then we're not going to grow out of an old model, right? And I think you're right that the hospice work is not the first thing that happens, but we'll start to notice it. You'll start to notice it in your families, in the dinner tables, in your board meetings, that our old ways of working are still, I call the word haunting us, are still in the room. But I wouldn't be bothered in the first phase of a crisis figuring out what's essential. That makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, let's look at someone else have a question. There's a question from Maria about how do we not control the situation and still be responsible in shifting our business to adapt and change? What is the difference? That's a great question. Part of what we think about in the roles that people have, first of all, it's the idea that you're going to control reality. Many of us have been stripped of that in the last few weeks. And so the part of the question is, where does control come from? In one way, our need for control is something that lives inside of us that has nothing to do with reality. In some ways, in other ways, it's our responsibility. I think the thing that we talk about a lot in adaptive work is one of the oldest prayers, which is just the serenity prayer. This beautiful prayer of what is it that I have the power to control, and what can I not control, and how do I have the wisdom to know the difference? And in reality, our experience is the hardest part is the end, the wisdom to know the difference. And people are actually not so well equipped to figure out what is within their control and what is within their scope of influence. And so I think part of what we have is the illusion of control. And part of what we have is a real responsibility to keep answering that question in a routine basis. When we do this work, we think about the distinction between what is leadership and what is authority. In a way that we understand that distinction, many of the people on this call have both roles. Leadership is about changing the nature of the system, and authority is about delivering the nature of the system as it is or needs to be. If you think about it, we have relationships to authority since the moment we were born. That moment we have a child, they look to us for some very specific things. You look at in this crisis inside myself, this desperate need for people with authority to do their job well. You think about how deeply that lives in us, and how disappointing it is when it doesn't happen. But what's really interesting when we think about those people in control or in authority, we really expect them to do three things. We expect them to give us some direction of where we're headed. We expect them to put some order into chaos. And we expect them to make us feel as safe as possible. Now, what's really interesting is those three functions that we hope for, where we want someone to be in control. Every three of those, each one of those is tested at the moment. Each one of those is trying to challenge. And so the control we can have is iteratively answering those questions well. What is the next horizon for us? Is our horizon 2 weeks out? Is it 3 months out? Where does that horizon, what is the path we might take? Those people who can deliver a pathway without over-promising and without under-promising, of giving direction, is going to be really critical at this time. The sense of order, how are we going to do this? One of the miracles we've seen is that people can adjust. We can go online, we can eat differently, we can do those things. People are capable of change when they know the direction and they know there's some system in place. And then this last question, which is really difficult, about how do we keep each other safe? And how do we answer those questions in the modern moment becomes really important. And so part of what we can control is the best version of those three answers to our teams, to our families, to our children, to our stubborn aging parents. Where are we headed? What are we going to put in place to get there? And how are we going to keep ourselves as safe as possible? That feels like today's answer is within our control. What's not in our control is keeping things without fragility, without change, and without anything else. And so the ability to adapt and change in the way and the frame we try to give is very much this question of how much of what has been can we hold on to, reassuring our teams that these percentage of what we do will be here tomorrow and we'll do it again. Which parts of them do we need to let go of? And what do we have to start doing to grow into ourselves? So we can control that aspect of giving direction and meaning and consequence to our teams without over-promising it. One of the ways that we always think about this work and why we call it adaptation is because not everything changes. Sometimes when I draw those overlapping circles of what's present, what's expendable, what's emerging, I do it in a very generous way. It looks like we only got to give 5% up. The Venn diagram in this moment is collapsing in a way where it's much more, we're having to give up much more than any of us wanted to. And essentially, that is driving Frank's question of what is essential. When more of what you took for granted or was part of your normalcy is actually noise, how do you know what's essential? We're being forced to look at that question in a way that's very productive if we can come up with a substantive and crisp answer. Again, part of what we're coming up with is some of what's essential is key, and some of what we wanted to have as essential or what made us feel safe is going away. For many people that I've talked to, the place they felt most alive and safe was at work. It was actually the reason to escape. And so we have now, people are losing things that are quite tangible. We are going to see an uptake in mental health challenge. We're seeing an uptake in lots of home abuse and spousal abuse in ways that are very different. We have colleagues who are having phone calls with their coworkers just so that they're seen every day in a way that gives them some safety for what their existence is at home. And so I don't want to pretend that this work is easy. We think about adaptive work as perspiration work, not inspiration work. And the myth of control, we set up a system that controlled for some things, and now we have a chance to do it differently. But our experience is that when we answer in community, in dialogue, well, those questions of direction, protection, order, we can give more stability to it and then do some of the next work. That was a longer answer. Hopefully useful.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Zander. Very useful.
Zander, very useful. Thank you. I just want to say something about what is essential.
Yeah.
And in my experience, I've seen so much cooperation and very direct conversation with my business partners, with my network, and truthfulness, and a lot of awareness. Also, people take ownership about their fierce reaction and say, "Sorry, I'm not like this," but in the moment. So you start talking about the relationship. You share how grateful you are for the connections you already have, and there is much more capacity to share appreciation. And I'd make the distinction between limitless and limited values, and love and appreciation is something, if you share it, it becomes bigger. And I experience this is right now as well. So my heart is half torn because it's something, wow, the time is now, and I always wanted that so direct, and now we are here. But on the other side, I feel also the pain, and it's holding both, and I can't, just say everything is fine. It doesn't feel fine in my heart, even though I see there is this bliss around this whole thing in my life too. And with a lot of people. And now, one last thing. I think the difference now is everybody had adaptive challenges in the past in his life, several times. So now we have it all at once, the whole humanity at once. And that is a huge difference.
Yeah.
We've never done that.
Yeah.
Not in this way.
Not in this way. That's
No
true.
way.
Yeah. And partially one of the haunting questions for me is if we don't answer some of those questions now together, what's the next version of it going to be? And so I think one of the most beautiful things that we've seen, as you said, is the capacity to collaborate, right? And the capacity to sacrifice for something bigger than ourselves. And that's wonderful. I do want to also say that what do we then do with that capacity? One of the ways I understand and see people are collaborating at the moment with those who look the most similar to them and have the strongest ties. And so part of what we want to figure out is how do we nurture that collaborative capacity? Before this, or let me answer it a different way, there's no way to be fully competent at this moment. This is new for all of us. one way to sort of characterize the old world, or what was, is it was a competency Olympics, where we were supposed to walk around the planet and show everybody how competent we are. And so if we now see that there's this collaboration and sacrifice muscle, one of that questions is, two questions show up, or how do we strengthen that muscle, right? And what do we do with it? Because one of the things that has not been true is that we have been very good about asking for our needs. We have not built that capacity, most of us, in the same way we built other capacities for delivering and helping. And sometimes that skill set of asking is really critical. I think as a society, one of the problems is we've gotten into a epidemic of abstractionism, where things are so abstract that they kind of sound right, but there's no teeth, there's no consequence. And at my heart, I'm a pragmatist, right? And so I want to make sure that we're able to ask for what we need in collaboration in a way that's much more specific. I love that we're having a moment of gratitude. Even the language of gratitude to me is not specific enough. I have gratitude for you for this. In a moment when I needed this, this meant something to me. There's a way that we're about to have the opportunity to get quite specific with each other that I think is part of the skill set of ramping up the collaboration frame that you talked about. And if we don't figure out how to do that well, we're going to have wonderful collaborations with those who are most similar to us and not sort of unearth the rest of this potential. But yes, it is one of the most beautiful things, how quickly we've been able to adapt, the adaptation we're capable of, that we can collaborate and we can sacrifice for something bigger than ourselves. So fully agree. Okay.
Thank you.
My pleasure. I'm just trying to read through these other questions if someone what is the difference, between what is essential and what is most purposeful? That's an interesting question. First of all, I would say just my little quick rant on purpose is I think purpose often goes into the same abstract rant that everybody else does. And so I spend less time thinking about purpose and more about the question of assignment, of what am I here to do right now? What is the manifestation of my meaning in existence? And I think what's true is that what is essential is equally about survival as it is around what's purposeful. And what we're about to see is people's survival instincts act out in a bunch of ways. Half of those ways I anticipate will be generative, creative, forming the new norms of what happened. And the other half of the essential activities will be the dinosaur claws of the old system trying to hold on to stability. And I wish I could tell you a better story that it's all going to be blissful and creative, but I don't believe that. I think what we're about to see is the duality of those two things, of what is generative, holistic, integrative that allows people to connect. And on the other hand, what holds on to power, what holds on to stability in a way that is narrower and myopic in scope. And so when someone shares this is essential, I want to begin to think about it's essential for what and for whom. It's essential with what time stamp, for the immediacy, for whom, for what period. And so I think this question of what is essential, you want to be very careful about what the definition or criteria of those elements are. That's really important. What's another question we have here? Or please ask one if you have one. It's nice hearing your voices too.
Hi Zander, it's Joe. I typed it in the chat box there. How are you?
Good. I'm having trouble reading the chat box as fast as I can see your face.
I know, it's nuts. I feel you. A little while ago, and I'm not going to be able to paraphrase it correctly, but you said something along the lines that optimizing for one group in society or one circle in society isn't the path to being able to optimize for, for the system as a whole. And so what I'm kind of curious or reflecting on at the moment is, in the real world, therefore, how do we in our circles, each of us here on this call has our own community, our own leadership space, our own, you know, what have you. How do we optimize within that, but between that in such a way as that we can make this systemic shift, which is trying to be born? You know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, I think it makes sense, and it's the difficult part of this, right? Because it's the connection from us to the whole, right? So the idea that I said, just to repeat it, was that if you optimize the piece, if we optimize all of the pieces, the whole system does not optimize. And we could talk about that literally from our healthcare system to, you know, delivering these masks, right? Every single piece of it, if we optimize the piece, we don't optimize the whole. And there's lots of us who have defined ourselves by acting locally and done amazing work acting locally and really put our head down to do that work. And then at some point pick our head up and said, I'm trying to do this important thing in this broken context. One of my favorite quotes is by Krishnamurti, which says, there's no glory, I'm paraphrasing, of being unhealthy, but being healthy in a sick society, right? There's no glory in being healthy in your own little circle in a sick society, because we see now what happens, and we're seeing the beauty that we're actually all connected. And so, yes, I think it's a dual focus, as you're starting to ask, Joe, that we have to take care of our organization, our team, our community, but we can't stop and draw the boundaries there, because that's happening in a context. And those of us who've defined ourselves by being apolitical, neutral, not engaged, and defining ourselves narrowly, are now suffering from the insight that the system outside of it has large bearing. And now I can't give you some formula that you should spend 25% of your time thinking about the context you're operating in, or some formula, but I think it has to be both. As you have young children and I have children, it's very hard to think about how do I protect them and what are the boundaries with which I protect them. And part of me, the answer has to be about working outside. And so I think the work here is about how do we affect the system. Now, one of the things we would say, just to go back to a point from before, is that we're all also in a conversation of our own privilege at the moment. The privilege that some of us have to draw the boundaries narrowly inside our homes or whatever context it is. So it is, part of this question is about privilege and what do you do with it? All of us are in a survival mode. I appreciate that. That little bit of discretionary attention we have outside of that survival mode, what do we do with that? And where do we point that love, attention, gifts? But I do think this is going to be a massive phase of people becoming more political, more engaged, and understanding the consequence of that. We're about to see, I'm not a futurist, but we're about to see remarkable differences of conversations about how we do politics, how we do mail-in voting, all of those things. And again, I anticipate us seeing the best of humanity and the worst of it next to each other. But I think you're right, for all of us who have responsibility and have some bandwidth, we have a responsibility to think about how are we affecting and engaging the system, not just our own sort of little space. And that's hard to do when the needs of the people right in front of us are so present. Joe, does that help a bit?
Yeah, it does. Just that distinction around, you know, obviously there's nothing formulaic around it, but if enough of us, excuse me, the multitasking kids toys in the background, if those of us who can, you know, with that little bit of bandwidth, if we can inquire into that, how do we change that system? How do we be of support, not just because it's very tempting to look in at other little corners. You know, I could go help that corner, I could go help that corner. But what I'm really feeling at the moment is this is a paradigm shift moment. This is a, you know, how long the moment is, as you say, you know, it could be a very long moment where it gets worse before it gets better. Who knows, that dichotomous thing. But how do we work on at that systemic level? I guess it's, some curiosity to it.
Sorry, Joe. It's important just to note that this isn't martyrdom training, though.
No, God, no.
About exhausting ourselves and trying to do everything. It's trying to find this right recipe of where does my set of skills meet the skill set of the world, and how do I draw those boundaries wider than I did in the last version. So I think that's part of where the kind of work lands.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you.
So there's a few more questions. One of the questions is, how do we take this community pain and empathy and the sort of shared experience we have and relate to each other? I mean, that's a beautiful and hard question. Part of what we have, or part of what we think about in this work, is that people don't live in reality. They live in the story that they tell themselves about reality. And so part of what we have is a really interesting framing of this crisis and how and who it affects. Part of what we have here was an opportunity to think quite differently about our shared humanity, about what the narratives are that we're digesting. And so each of us has an opportunity to think about what is a better narrative to what's happening here. We are looking at a future, I believe, not in the long distance, where each of us will know someone who's sick, will know someone who's passed, will know someone who's lost their job, or multiple people who've lost their job. One of my mentors, I was talking to him today, who was just at the eve of retirement, now has sick, aging parents, and all of his children have lost their jobs and moved back in with him. And that's just a narrow, myopic American lens, not even looking at what happens to the communities around the world. And so for me, the question is, how are we shaping what narratives around this, and who are we letting shape it? And so I don't know the full skill set, and we'll talk more about this on Thursday's session around self-protection and how we understand those narratives. But this question of how do we actually face reality and the suffering that's happening, how could we minimize some of it, but how do we not continue to look away, will be some of our work. But again, we know in crisis, people will become myopic, institute borders in some real ways. But I would be careful to watch the stories that are starting to happen inside of you and what you're listening to as we shape some of this. Let me try and answer one more question, and then we can try and wrap up a little bit for today. Unless someone has okay. The last question is just sort of, how do you meet people? How do you meet people in this moment, given that everyone is going through a change process? Part of what we've seen in the most beautiful way are people starting with a question and shared humanity rather than jumping into agendas. But one of the things that we know in crisis is that the first two things that people lose is kind of compassion and perspective. And so the question is, how do we stay grounded in ourselves and in relationship rather than others? The set of choices that we have, I think we're 3 weeks out from some of the harder choices of what to do with our businesses, what to do with our families, where to land and live. And so part of what we're trying to do on these calls is think about, how do we equip ourselves and how do we equip others? Many of you on this call are responsible adults and caretakers and doers. I know inside of myself, some of my caring and doing has been to hide from the reality of everything we're about to face. And so I want to notice when I'm caring from an empathetic, generous place, or making decisions with others, or I'm doing it out of my own need to kind of process and hide what's happening. And so I just want to figure out, how do we have better protocols to kind of support each other in that. So I'm going to use that just as a way to thank you all for spending some time together, and thank you for spending time in small groups. As just an offer, we're spending this week doing these every day. So tomorrow will be a very structured process on scenario planning of how do we look at the scenarios in front of me? How do I get a more disciplined rubric to examine and prepare for those? How do I use those to then understand the decisions that are happening in the short term, medium, and long term? And we'll do a similar format every day with different topics. If there's ways that we're trying to just be of service, part of what this time is about is how are we able to metabolize or digest this adaptive moment. And so we're trying to use these calls to give people some tools, give people some community, and equip us for the moments that are here or the moments that are ahead. If there's ways we can improve that, please let us know. Just info@goodwolfgroup.com would be helpful. We're here to try and serve. Also, every time we do this, we're featuring different organizations that are helping people without a safety net And so today, Cut 50, Reform Alliance, Dream Corps, what they're doing to stop the prison pandemic and those who are suffering from that is a great cause. Just go to dreamcorps.org, and they're just extraordinary. And again, the crisis text hotline, everybody should know it. Home to 741-741. It does not show up on a single phone record ever. So there's no chance of those who are at risk having that come back to them in a different form. So again, please let us know what works, what you need more of, and just thank you for being together. As we talked about in adaptive work, it's a burden to carry it's a burden to carry this alone, and it's better to do it together. So we hope this was useful for you, and we'll see many of you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zander.
Thank you, Xander. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
Zander.
Zander.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Zander.